Welcome back to Sense and Sensibility, the show where we talk about all things money. Today, it's all things trade. And I have with me, so honored, Jon. Thank you so much for joining me. He is the former governor of Utah, state of Utah, Jon Huntsman. And also, you've been an ambassador to both Singapore and China. And there's one other title in there.
Oh, it's a father of seven. You missed that one.
Oh, father of seven. Yes, that's the most
the
important.
only one that matters, Heather.
The most important one, yes. So now, trade agreements, we talked about this earlier in the show, but we've got NAFTA and TTIP and TPP and all of these. First of all, what's the difference between a free trade agreement and the TIP? Isn't that just like a partnership? Is that just another word for trade?
These are all acronyms that basically take you to the same destination, and that is an arrangement of trade agreements that bring various countries to the table, and they try to get them all in unison in terms of how they treat one another. So you mentioned a bunch of trade agreements. So NAFTA was really negotiated in the 1990s between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, which together constitute the largest trading bloc in the world. You mentioned TTIP, which is a proposed trade agreement with the 28 countries of the European Union, which likely will not happen. It's not been negotiated. It's just an idea.
Oh, okay.
And then you mentioned
TPP,
the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which also is going nowhere. And that was an agreement between the United States and 11 other countries of the Asia-Pacific region, not including China, that represent about 40% of the world's GDP. So everything in the world, that 40% of that output was embodied in this agreement. So that's failed too. So we don't have a lot of, in fact, I can't remember the last time we had a trade agreement in recent years. Certainly the Obama administration has not done a lot in the way of trade agreements. The last one may have been with Korea. But I know that one well because that was negotiated for the most part under the Bush administration and just delayed. But to get a trade agreement done, it takes two things. And I know this well because I used to be a trade negotiator, whether people love you or hate you for that.
Right.
You have to negotiate a deal with another country, and then that has to be passed by Congress. They have to give it the vote. So they're very difficult to get done. And I remember this well from several agreements that we did under the Bush administration, which basically took our trade rules and another country's trade rules, and you make them basically unified. So it benefits our people. So you want to export your product into another marketplace. It doesn't deal with all the barriers we talked about earlier, all the taxes and tariffs and fees and all that stuff. It's eliminated if it trade agreement works.
So right now we are trading with Europe and in Asia, but we don't have an agreement in place that takes away some of those barriers. Is that correct?
We have trade agreements with various countries. They're called FTAs, free trade agreements. Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, Korea, just to name a few. But most in the Asia-Pacific region, we don't have real trade agreements with. Japan, for example, which is the third largest economy in the world, we have very little in the way of agreement on trade. So their markets are very, very much rigged against U.S. products. So I'm on the board of directors of Ford Motor Company. We make the best cars in the world, in my opinion. We have a really hard time getting our cars into Japan, even though they send a lot here because their markets are closed. And China has its own problems. India, of course, is nowhere near being able to do any kind of trade agreement. So
we're an open market. So it means, so like you were saying, like we would take the cars from Japan, even though they won't take our products.
What they do is their company, Toyota, for example, which is a very good manufacturing company, and they'll go to Tennessee or they'll go to Alabama and say, we want to manufacture cars here in the United States. So effectively, they want to be seen as if they were Ford or General Motors or Chrysler in the sense that they're manufacturing here locally. So the Japanese cars that are being bought here in the United States are generally all manufactured here in the United States. Their parts might come in from Japan, which would give them a discount of sorts because we call it in trade, we call it reciprocity. It means, both sides treat each other equally. We just don't have that with most countries of the world.
So why is a trade agreement such a political beast? Like, I remember the NAFTA going, that was the very first time I was ever made aware of free trade in the early 90s. And I went, well, what's the big deal? Why is it such a concern for some people to trade with other or have this free trade? What makes that such a horrible idea and or such a good idea?
Because most of the countries we trade with are less developed than we are. They're way behind in terms of the average income, the freedom of their people, the tariffs and taxes on average. And so there really isn't another country like the United States with whom we can do a parallel agreement where they're as advanced as we are. Maybe some in Europe, but generally the countries with whom we trade, where a lot of stuff is made, they're well below our standards of trade. So an agreement would try to lift them up. In the case of NAFTA, Canada was an advanced country like the United States. Mexico, less advanced, was to lift them up by having them aspire to new standards for manufacturing, for tariffs, bringing products across the border. And here's what happens. It's interesting because when our economy in the United States is weak, as it has been ever since the great economic storm of 2008, when so many people lost their savings, the value of their home, and the whole economy just broke, then people look for scapegoats. Who's responsible for this? Why aren't we growing as an economy? Why aren't we producing more jobs? Why do we have this stubbornly high unemployment? It's interesting to note that our unemployment here in Utah is probably the lowest in the country at about 2.5%. I mean, just incredible. But a lot of states aren't that privileged. They have higher unemployment rates. So immediately the conversation goes to trade, because that's an easy political conversation to have. And in a political season, you can blame other countries for what they have done in terms of unfair practices, and it resonates pretty well. What you don't hear talked about, and one of the things that I think is most responsible for our economic deterioration, at least the loss of jobs, is the advance of technology. So technology has displaced a lot more people than trade has when you start looking at the numbers. And that is, we have more automation in factories, we have more robotics, we have a digital economy that makes the machine, like I carry right here in my pocket, responsible for so much more that in earlier days would have been done by people. So but that's not a sexy political argument when you say this is why we're doing so poorly. It's technology. It's my iPhone. It's my iPad. It's a digital economy. It's robotics. That doesn't get a big applause line when you're doing politics. When you can blame a country, say their practices are bad, and generally there's some evidence that is a valid argument to some extent. That gets you places, as we saw in this last election cycle.
Okay. All right. Well, I think you've gone through most of my questions and the big concerns I have about trade and what does it mean for me, especially. So
we will always be a trading state, Heather. Can I tell you this from my days as governor?
Yeah.
Whether it's visiting the alfalfa farmers in Millard County who were growing alfalfa and sending it to China. I remember when we opened up the alfalfa market in China and the soybean market in China for what it did for the farmers in the Midwest, for example. They have a new customer that they never had before. And selling that alfalfa into the marketplace of China all of a sudden allows more money to be made and for the business to be expanded.
Hey, does China allow GMO crops? Because Europe doesn't. We cannot export GMO soybeans over there.
I don't. Since we don't have an agreement to that detail with China, I would say that it nothing governs that form of trade in GMO products.
Okay.
Although some would argue that GMO products fortified with vitamins are very important in places like sub-Saharan Africa, where you don't get a good yield and where you don't have vitamins readily available for the population. If you can get them in a seed that ultimately is going to go toward agriculture, that's putting you ahead in the game. So again, with all of these issues, there are two debates, there are two sides of the argument. and it's always fun to have them.
Okay. So what has Huntsman Corp got for the world coming up here real soon?
Well, Huntsman Corp is a great company, and nobody ever thought in the Huntsman family we'd ever have a Huntsman Corp. But the only thing that's important to us is making sure that it's successful, because it's one of the engines of funding the Huntsman Cancer Institute, which is really the thing that matters most to the Huntsman family, which has been around now for 20 years. Then I have the great privilege of chairing the Cancer Institute, and it's saving a lot of lives, and a lot of people are able to access probably the best cancer center anywhere in the Western United States, maybe the best in the country, certainly when it comes to genomics-based research. So it's a big deal.
Great. Thank you again so much, Jon, for joining me. We could probably go on for another couple of hours.
We'll do it again, Heather.
Yes.
Anytime.
Yeah, we'll talk about other trade things, especially as we get a new president and see what he decides to do with some of our agreements.
This will be really interesting. Yeah, we'll talk about that, because it's going to be playing out in real time here.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, well, thank you so much. Former Governor Jon Huntsman, he was the governor of Utah for several years, and also...
Best job in the world.
Yes, and let me tell you, I was very disappointed. I know it was a good move for you to go to China, but I kind of missed you as the governor of Utah.
When your country asks you to do something, you kind of have to do it.
Exactly.
My son's in the military are learning that.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jon, and we will hopefully have you back on.
Great, Heather. Thank you.
Very soon.
What a treat.